All right, you are free to start.
All right, thanks. Evening, everybody. My name is Nathan Kelby. I'm the Broomfield County Noxious Weed Coordinator. And tonight I'm going to be talking about noxious weed control. I'll get into more of the noxious weed control. I'll talk at a high level and at a low level tonight. Just so you know, I'm not a very formal speaker. So anytime you have any questions, please feel free to chime in. There's not a whole lot of us because it's just too darn nice to sit inside and listen to me tonight. So with that, I'm going to start out with a general definition, which is, what is a weed? And basically what I did is I looked this up in Webster's dictionary. And what I found was, the first one was a valueless plant growing wildly, especially one that grows on cultivated ground to the exclusion of a desired crop. To me, that's a problem because then can a native plant be a weed by this definition? And yes, me as a land manager looking at it from a natural resources standpoint, that's a problem for me. But looking at it from a standpoint of somebody who's looking at agriculture, it's a little bit different. So I think it really depends. Your definition of a weed really depends on what you're trying to do and what your desired crop is, what your actual goal is. So now basically we've defined what a weed is. And basically for all intents and purposes is a plant growing out of place. But now what is a noxious weed? And basically a noxious weed is a non-native plant that is legally, and I say legally and I have legally highlighted because it has to be legally labeled. It has to be by some measure of the, by someone or some entity, it has to be legally labeled as a nuisance and causes economic or ecological hardships on land managers or entities that are managing that land. So it's basically what makes the noxious weed is it's a non-native plant that has been legally labeled as a nuisance. So the impacts of noxious weeds, you know, we've kind of defined what a noxious weeds is, but why are we really controlling them? What's the real problem here? We have loss of habitat. It outcompetes natives. It forms dense monocultures, and it basically affects the structure of the soil and the overall functioning of the ecosystem as a whole. You have decreased land values, and I'm not just talking about agricultural land as well. I'll get back into that a little bit more, but it's further reaching than that. And then we have loss of crops. When I talk about this, I'm talking about land carrying capacity. That's from an agricultural standpoint, but you have to actually put in both plant and animal as well. The argument there is yes, some non-native plants can provide for animal and bird life, but what tends to happen with these noxious weeds is they tend to get out of control for several reasons. We'll get into those in a little while. Another reason to control them, they're a danger to livestock. Star thistle, which is a list A species here in Colorado, is poisonous to horses. Leafy spurge, which is actually a B list species in Colorado. And I'll get into the A, B, and C lists. So if you have any questions about that, I am going to cover that very shortly, what the A, B, and C lists are pertaining to the Colorado Noxious Weed Act. Leafy spurge is poisonous to cattle and to horses. And then cheatgrass or downy brome, when grazed after seeding, can cause mouth issues with grazing animals. There's also an increased fire danger with some of these weeds, cheatgrass especially, when it becomes almost a monoculture. It's a very, very flammable plant, and it does tend to take over. The reason they call it cheatgrass is because it's actually an annual weed that basically sets seed in the fall and then grows like a minute 2-inch plant. And then in the spring, when things warm up, it's got a 2-inch advantage on all the other vegetation around it, and it tends to take over. And then there's also the possibility that it's poisonous to humans. So poison hemlock, which is a list B species here in the state of Colorado, we do have it in Broomfield County. It's every part of the plant is poisonous, from the roots to the seeds to the flowers to the stem. It's hollow stemmed, and actually, when kids cut it in half, it actually kind of looks like a straw. And every year, somewhere in the United States, kids get into this stuff and they actually use it as a straw, and then they end up in the emergency room. I haven't heard of anybody dying from it. You'd really have to ingest a decent amount of it in order to pass away from it, but every part of it's poisonous. Another one we have problems with for humans is leafy spurge, which is a list A species in the state of Colorado. And I'm going to go over that plant later on in this presentation. It's a skin irritant. It has a milky sap that's actually caustic, and it can cause blindness. It had to be about 5 years ago. I got a call from a Broomfield resident letting me know that their sons and their friends actually got into some leafy spurge, and they basically broke it open and they looked at the milky sap and they thought, what a great idea. And they basically used it as war paint. And they put it on they took off it was summertime. They took off their shirts, put it on their chest, put it on their face. They did end up in the emergency room and they figured out what happened, but, and they were okay, but it did basically cause them to have basically caustic burns on their skin. So those are some of the reasons why we do control them. Now, I mean, everybody kind of looks at this and go, can this truly affect us, like in our homes and in our daily life? And it does in some ways that you don't really see, but then there's other ways where it does affect us that you can see. The ways that we don't see, I would say, would be the cost of agriculture and the cost of control. And those measures that are taken, those are kind of passed on to the consumer. But the example I'm using is actually out of England. And this example is for Japanese knotweed, which is a huge problem over there. It is a weed we do have in Colorado. It is present. The nearest county is Boulder County that has it. It is a list A species. It does grow extremely rapidly. And this example kind of puts things in perspective as to why we need to look at some of these things and control them. So the invasive weed was discovered in England in a garden in a new build house in April of 2009. And the couple had been living there for about a month. A couple months later, it was actually found growing in their dining room. And that picture is basically from their dining room. That's not a potted plant. That basically came up through the foundation, through everything, and basically grew into their dining room. Basically, you know, I've actually researched this right before I gave this a couple days ago. I actually researched it a little bit further to see if I could find any more on this. And I didn't find anything else beyond what I have found in this presentation, but they were told that the 10 feet or 3 meters of the soil underneath their house need to be removed from beneath the foundation to remove the plant. Basically, the value of the house dropped, and this is 2009 values. It dropped from 305,000 pounds to 50,000 pounds. And basically what eventually did happening, and they did do this, they actually had to demolish the home entirely and completely because structurally it was so weakened by the invasive nature of the plant that they had no choice but to demolish the home. They did sue the builders, and I don't know the result of that, but basically that's what did have to happen. So, and I've read a little bit more about it, but further issues that have come out in England because of this, mortgage companies are now refusing to mortgage homes with Japanese knotweed on the property. And there was actually something else on the internet where I watched where a housing developer basically bought a piece of property, Japanese knotweed was found on it, and they had to remove a similar amount of topsoil from the entire thing before they subdivided and started building. So it cost them, you know, millions and millions of dollars just because the plant was present. So we kind of know how noxious weeds affect us. Now I want to kind of tell you why it is that way and why these noxious weeds are a problem. So I'm going to go through some of the characteristics of noxious weeds. As I stated before in the definition of a noxious weeds, they are non-native. And the example here I'm using is Russian olive. Basically, Russian olive, it's a native to Eurasia. It was introduced as an ornamental and as a windrow during the Dust Bowl era. So it's a real problem in our riparian corridors. It's a List B species in Colorado. Other characteristics of a noxious weed, because they're non-native, there's a lack of natural controls occurring within the ecosystem. There's no insects that basically feed on these plants. There's no diseases that affect them in general. And fungi really, basically because they were developed someplace else, the fungi that are present here don't tend to affect them. Then there's other native competing plants just aren't present to get them under control. And Russian olive, and I'll go over this a little bit later, but Russian olive is actually an allelopathic plant, and I'll go over that definition in a while. But what it does is it sends out chemicals into the soil and into the surrounding area to reduce other vegetation from growing. So there's a lot of different reasons, and we'll get into some of those in a little while. They tend to be adapted to the environment where they're problematic. So here in Colorado, they're used to our temperature extremes, our precipitation regimes, the soil conditions. And that varies from place to place. I mean, what you're going to find, and you'll find that here within the state, because as a whole, because as we go from the plains out east to the mountains and above, we have differences in problems as far as the noxious weeds present, because some of them can handle, some of them are better adapted to the dry, intense extremes that we have along the Front Range, and then other ones are better adapted to the wetter regions of the mountains. So it just depends from place to place. And this varies from state to state and from region to region. It's just based on what they're encountering there. So they tend to be prolific seeders. It's not always true, but most of them tend to be this way. This example is purple loosestrife. It's a List A species in Colorado. And each flower spike can produce 120,000 seeds. So basically, when you look at a plant, a single plant is then capable of producing upwards of 3 million seeds in a single growing season. The picture that's in here, I will say that purple loosestrife is a much larger problem back in the eastern United States. Tends to do better there, but we do have it in the state. It is a List A species, and we are combating it and controlling it. We did have it in Broomfield. I haven't found it in the last 3 years, but I know there are areas that it is present, and so far we've gotten it under control. We're trying to maintain that, and we're just basically every year we go out and make sure that that's being maintained. And then this is always my favorite, is seed longevity. People don't think about this when they think about plants, but how long can a seed sit in the ground, and how long is it viable? And honestly, it's not something I thought about a whole heck of a lot until I, started reading a little bit more and learning a little bit more. But basically, I'll give you some examples. So the first one is purple loosestrife. It can lay dormant in the soil anywhere from 5 to 20 years. Next one's Canada thistle. It can basically lay dormant for 25 to 30 years. Musk thistle is 35 to 40 years in the soil. And field bindweed, everybody's favorite. This is why you have so much trouble controlling it, especially if you let it go to flower in your lawn, is 50 years in the soil. And that's still skimming the surface a little bit. The big winner is moth mullein at 125 years. I'll be honest with you, this list is a little outdated. I would say that musk thistle's probably gone up to 45 to 50 years. And I know that moth mullein, they're still upping that. Another one, common mullein, which is in the same genus, basically, it's gone up to they had it at, God, I think they had it at 50 or 60 years when I started. They've got it to 80 now, and I think it's just going to go up from there. As far as seed longevity go, just to give you guys an idea of how long some seeds can be viable, this is situational, but a book I read called Lab Girl, they actually found a seed in a peat bog. They carbon dated the husk on it. But before they carbon dated the husk, they basically pulled the seed out and started to grow it. And it sprouted. They then carbon dated the husk on the seed, and it was 4,000 years old. Now that's situational. It was in a peat bog. It survived. It was encased. But that gives you an idea of how long some of these plants can actually be in an ecosystem and actually be viable. So it's something that I always point out to people, is because I think it's one of the biggest things that people lack in understanding of some of our native, both native and non-native plant species, is seed longevity. More characteristics, a lot of them spread vegetatively. Phragmites, which is a big problem back east, we do have it in the state. We do have it in Broomfield County in one location, and I'm monitoring it because it's on private property. But Phragmites, I'm basically from the Chicagoland area. And every time I go back there, it's basically taken over marshes and wetlands back there. And it can spread in a single day, anywhere from, or not a single day, excuse me, in a single growing season, anywhere from 15 to 25 feet. So you start adding that up, and it's pretty impressive what it can do given 2, 3, 4, 5 years. More characteristics. I think basically all plants do this, but a lot of our non-native plants tend to do it very well, and that's seed dispersal mechanisms. So most of the tumbleweeds that we have basically are noxious weeds. There's 3 listed: knapweeds, spotted, diffuse, and then Russian. They are all B-list species. They're all tumbleweeds. And there's 2 that are non-listed that are non-natives: Russian thistle and kochia, which are the real culprits. Those are the ones you see the most tumbleweeds of, but basically those are tumbleweeds as well. And then wind. A lot of these guys get blown. I mean, they have elongated feather-like seed appendages that carry them for miles and miles and miles. And it's really effective. I can vouch for that, having been around them for a long time. Once they've gone to seed, and the winds that we get here along the Front Range when thunderstorms move in the summer, when things are basically have gone to seed, I've watched Canada thistle just create a snowstorm from the seed. Mammals will transport them, burdock and puncture vine. Burdock is the one that really gets caught in your dog's fur. Puncture vine's the one that your dog will basically start limping on because they've got the puncture vine or goat head in their foot. Water. A lot of these seeds survive in rivers and lakes, and I like to point that out. So when I talk about seed longevity too, so in the drought, I think it was, 2002, I believe. In the drought of 2002, when Horsetooth Reservoir was at it was at a ridiculously small capacity, but basically the riverbed, the lake bed came to the surface, and what happened is basically a huge dense monoculture of Canada thistle popped up out of the lake bed. So that gives you an idea how tough some of these seeds are. And then the last one is birds. They will transport it, and the one that they transport the most, unfortunately, is Russian olive. I'm a birder and I love birds, but they do tend to transport this seed particularly well, and they actually prep it for germination very well too. So how do we control them? I mean, honestly, after I give the talk about what I just talked about, it's always very daunting to think about how do you control that? What do you do? And basically how I approach it from an integrated weed management approach. So this is a definition taken from Biology and Management of Noxious Rangeline Weeds. And I always use it, but then I give my definition next. It's a structured approach to system management based on general understanding of the ecology, uses, and interactions of the plants and animals within the system. To me, that's just what you're saying is, to my definition is using all the tools available to reach a desired weed management goal, taking into account the areas that are being treated and their uses, both human and otherwise. So really it's dependent upon what you're trying to do. This farmer is going to have a totally different view of what he's looking for in controlling weeds on his property, as opposed to me as a land manager for the city and county of Broomfield, as opposed to any of you listening, or any homeowner or small acreage owner who might have horses or anything else, just looking at your lawn or just looking at your garden or looking at other things so it's really based on what your desired weed management goal is. So now different ways of controlling them. Obviously mechanical is one way to do it. You can pull them, you can mow them, you can plow them. You can do chainsaw removal on trees as required, any physical removal of the plant. And if you are removing the plants, what I do advise is you need to understand the biology of the plants, and I'm going to go through a couple of them. But if you are removing plants that have gone to seed, I always say that you really need to bag them and make sure that you're disposing of them properly. And then biological control is using living organisms to actually control the weeds. So there are biological control insects. This one that's listed here is actually called the fecal shield beetle. It was actually introduced by the Colorado Insectary, and I'll go into this a little bit more, but basically the Colorado Insectary is based out of Palisade. They produce biocontrols for the state and for other states. For certain plant species that are non-native. It's very thorough testing. A lot of these insects are very, very plant specific. So this guy I actually found up on the Hoops property, which is at the northwest corner of 144th and Lowell, feeding on Canada thistle, and it is specific to Canada thistle. So, but I never introduced them. These have been introduced into the state, but almost every property I encounter in Broomfield tends to have them on it. So you can also graze, and grazing does work. Boulder has a pretty hefty grazing program on a lot of their open spaces. We do use goat grazing in Broomfield. Sometimes it's out there in the open, sometimes it's not. It just depends on what I'm trying to control. But we do use them, and I'm going to give an example of how I've used them in the past. Another one is soil pathogens. This is one that's been dangled in front of land managers for a while now. There's a company based out of Washington State that has actually found a native soil pathogen that helps control cheatgrass. And every time they present, the first question out of everybody's mouth is, when is it going to be available? And they always kind of skirt the issue. So I don't know what's going on there, but eventually we're going to hopefully get some soil pathogens for control as well. Cultural control, again, grazing falls into this category as well. Revegetation, and then competition to create, and basically the revegetation is to create competition for the non-native plants. And then obviously there is chemical control. Herbicidal treatment is definitely part of any integrated weed management plan. Obviously we want to limit its use as much as possible. And when we do use it, we want to be as effective as we can be, and use it properly. There's broadcast and spot treatments. Broadcast is blanket coverage. Very rarely do we use blanket coverage here in Broomfield. We have done some blanket control in some of our open spaces for cheatgrass using a pre-emergent, which has worked really well. Boulder County kind of piloted that with the company that produces it, and they had spectacular results. So we've kind of actually rode their, basically, used them as an example and basically kind of copied what they're doing a little bit. But we generally do use spot control, and this is selective to individuals or groups of plants. So, I've told you, like, basically the tools that we use to do that. Now you need a plan. And I'm going to be speaking from a broad sense as far as a management plan is concerned. A lot of you that are listening are probably not large acreage owners, or you may be a small acreage owner, which you can use these methods, but a lot of you might be just general homeowners and you're on less than a quarter acre property. So it just depends on what your management goals are. So a management plan helps you set your priorities and philosophies for open properties. It describes the site, the conservation targets, and the goals, and it explains to you how these weeds are a threat to that property and the goals that you're trying to achieve. And the contents, and this is basically for almost every single open space, well, basically for most of them, for most open spaces that we have in Broomfield, I've created an open space a weed management plan for each site. I take an inventory and a map of the site, which you can see on the right-hand side. If anybody listening is aware, this is basically off of 120th. Country Vista is back behind where the Walmart is. It's just to the northwest of the Walmart site. It also explains your management philosophy. It sets your priorities, your summary of your actions planned, and then each weed generally has its own separate plan because every weed is different and needs to be treated differently. Some are perennials, some are biennials, some are woody, some are herbaceous, so it just depends on what you're dealing with. So what we've covered so far, we've defined a weed and a noxious weed, the impacts they have on the land and ourselves, characteristics, our tools for control, and now we need to talk about the plants themselves, but I want to just cover a few plant terms first so that when I do cover these and I am saying these terms that you understand exactly what I'm talking about, and feel free to chime in with any questions at any point in time. So plant terms, a perennial is a plant that lives several to many seasons, and it can be woody or herbaceous. When I say woody, what I'm talking about is tree species and shrub species that basically form a woody stem and either lose their leaves or keep them on. And then basically they continue to grow the following season based on that wood, on what was previously grown upon. And then herbaceous species basically usually they die back all the way to the ground every year, and then they push out a brand new plant every year. Just so you know, perennials, the one thing I say about perennials is you have short-lived and long-lived. Just as an example, I've got some grasses in my front garden called silver feather grass. I would say that on average, the lifespan of them is probably about 2 to 5 years. And then they tend to die out. What tends to happen though is I get enough seed where I get more of them and I just remove the ones where I don't like where they are, and the ones that I like where they're located, I leave them. So, and then you have really long-lived species like trees, which can live upwards of thousands of years. Annuals, they germinate, flower, and seed during one single growing season. Biennials, a plant that lives 2 years, blooming in the second. And then a winter annual, it germinates in the late summer or fall over winter, and then flower in the spring. And then I always say, and I haven't been really spouting off the scientific names, a lot of people get annoyed with them, but really all that Latin. Problem is common names are very confusing. If you say the scientific name, it's the same in Japan, it's the same in Colorado, it's the same wherever you go, no matter what you do, as far as the plant name itself. So more plant terms, you're going to hear me refer to what's called a rosette. And a lot of times when you're reading articles on controlling specifically a lot of our thistles, you'll hear what's called the rosette stage. And what that is basically the rosette is a circle of leaves emerging at the base of the plant. But what tends to happen is usually with the biennial thistles is you get the seed that comes out from the plant during the growing season, and then it either lays dormant or that year it basically germinates. And what it tends to do is basically form that rosette and overwinter as the rosette. So that's what I'm referring to when I talk about rosettes. Rhizomes are a creeping underground stem. They're actually not a root, they're a stem, so it's a little bit different. When I say prostrate, I'm talking about growing horizontally on the ground. And then I mentioned allelopathic before. That means you're producing chemicals that impact the growth of competing plants. And then forbs, you'll hear me say that. Forbs, basically it's a general term for a herbaceous flowering plant that is not a grass or sedge or a rush. It's generally used in vegetation ecology, especially in relation to grasslands and understory species in a forest. A little bit about plant terms on leaf structure. When you hear me say alternate, it's basically what you see there on the left. It basically alternates up the stem of the plant or on the branch. Opposite, as you can see in the middle, is basically on opposite sides of the stem or opposite sides of the branch is where the leaves tend to come out. And then whorled, basically you have multiple leaves coming, more than 2 leaves coming out from one location on a plant. So a little bit about the noxious weed list before we jump into the weeds, just so you understand a little bit more about the Colorado Noxious Weed List and the Act. Basically, there's the List A, which there's 23 species on this list. Not all of them are present in the state, but basically these plants must be eradicated wherever detected in order to protect neighboring communities and the state as a whole. Currently, we have 3 List A species in Broomfield. We have Myrtle Spurge, we have hairy willowherb, and we have purple loosestrife. That's that I know of. Like I always put that caveat out there because that's what I know of. Boulder County and Jefferson County, I think it's Boulder County, Jefferson County, they tend to be the winners on this. They tend to have the most, unfortunately, and they butt up right against us. So we got to be careful. And when I said that there are some that are listed on here that are not present in the state, they are present probably in a bordering state, and that's why we need to keep an eye on them because we don't want them creeping into the state. List B species, which there's 35 species of. Management's required for these plants, and the state creates management plans for them. I'm in contact with the state every year, talking to them about every year they pick a certain amount of the B list species they want to talk to me about, and we discuss management goals with them. And then list C species, there's 16 species on this. Management is not required, but it can be supported through the state. And these are the things that what I would say is they're probably not going anywhere. Bindweed's probably not going anywhere, unfortunately. And some of the B-list species too are probably not going anywhere, probably, but we need to get them under control and do the best we can. So now I'm going to jump into some of the actual species listed in the state, give you some examples. And I will start with everybody's favorite, which is field bindweed, Convolvulus arvensis. It's a list C species. It's so prevalent, there's no way we can possibly get it totally under control, unfortunately. It is a perennial, has a very extensive root system. It's a vine with stems 1 to 4 feet long. It flowers from early through late summer. It has arrow-shaped alternate leaves, and it's very aggressive. Shallow tillage only increases the number of plants, and I told you earlier the seed is viable for 50 plus years in the soil, and I expect that to probably go up. Pulling on a large scale, really not possible. but in small garden situations, it can work. That's how I control it in my front garden. I've got it in my front garden, and I've got it in my front lawn, and I deal with it that way as much as I can. Problem with, and tilling can work. The problem with it is it must be deep enough and occur 12 days after the plant emerges. And unfortunately, when I say tilling must be deep, I'm talking 6 to 8 inches. And then you need to do it 16 to 18 times over a 2-year period. So that kind of gives you an idea of agriculturally what you would have to do to try and control it without using any chemical control. And if you ever get a chance, the flowers pictured in the lower right, but in the upper right is a picture of the seeds. And if you ever get a chance, if you find some of these, you should take a look at them, because I've taken a hammer to them, and they're pretty. I mean, it basically takes a hammer to break them apart. You can't stomp on them. You can't break them apart. They're very tough, and they just, even after fires, I think that they're still there. If the fire is intense enough, it'll probably take care of them. But if it's not going to do much to the seed. So control mechanisms, there are biocontrols available. There are actually mites and moths available through Colorado State Insectary. The one thing I always put out there about biocontrols is they're not going to eat themselves out of house and home. And it does take a while for those populations to build up. So my sister-in-law has used it on her small acreage property, and she seems to feel she's gotten good control. I basically have a lot of areas where I've used them, and I've gotten mine through the Colorado State Insectary, and it's worked very well in open space areas to help just kind of control it and keep it at bay to some degree. Herbicidal treatments, you can use 2,4-D, dicamba, glyphosate, quinclorac, and imazapyr. The two that I would lean toward would be either dicamba or quinclorac on this. And I will get into this. All of the chemicals that I'm talking about are available commercially for homeowners to buy. You could pull it off the shelf at your local Home Depot or Lowe's. You just have to look at the active ingredients list on the back to make sure that it's present. Canada thistle, Cersei Marvins, is a list B species. It is a perennial. It reproduces by seed and rhizomes. It's 1 to 4 feet tall. It has an erect hollow stem, lance-shaped leaves with spines. It's a thistle, so of course it's spiny. And the flowers are pink to purple and then sometimes white. Very rarely do I encounter them in white. What you're probably going to see in your lawn is probably what's pictured in the lower left. That's what most of you are going to be dealing with in your lawns. It produces really well vegetatively. That's why it's such a problem. So continuing on, the rosettes present themselves fall to spring. The root system is extensive and creeping, forming huge colonies. The picture on the right, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this site. Basically, you can kind of see the white and the brown in the foreground, and then you see kind of a purplish hue, and it kind of goes all the way off into the distance. This is at the Hoops property at 144th and Lowell at the northwest corner, across from the Safeway. And I had about 55 acres of this when I started here in 2007. And we're going to get into that, but that gives you an idea of how extensive it can be. It just takes over, and it's basically I didn't have a total monoculture, but it was pretty darn close. And again, you have a seed longevity about 25 years. Control measures, pulling will work if the plant is pulled completely early in its life. But generally what you're encountering is that when you encounter one plant and then you start to look around, if you see others, those are probably connected through the underground root system and stem system. And usually what happens when you pull one, when they're at that point, is wherever you pulled it from, you're not going to get the entire plant out of the ground, and it'll pop off at a desired spot that it tends to pop off at. And then you go from one plant to generally 3 or 4, unfortunately. Mowing, it works well in conjunction with herbicidal treatments. It's not called Canada Thistle because it's from Canada. It's actually called Canada Thistle because the Canadians came up with a great way of controlling it, which is basically what they went in and with some like they would go into large acreage properties. They basically mowed it when it started to bolt, which means basically right as the plant starts to push its vegetation upward, and they would mow it 3 times throughout the growing season, 3 or 4 times throughout the growing season. And they would basically let it almost go to flower, and then they would knock it down again. And then they would come in the fall and they would use an herbicidal treatment. And what that did is it basically weakened it. It was using all its resources to try and grow, and then they would knock it back. And they were stressing it out, and then they would come in, and the herbicidal treatments were much more effective for that reason. There are biocontrols available through the Colorado State Insectary. Some of them are available, some of them are not. Basically, there's a lot of stuff out there it's gotten so prolific in the state it's no longer available. But you can check those out if you'd like to. Usually, what I say is, unless you have a really, really serious problem, biocontrol is probably not the way to go for small infestations. Herbicides 2,4-D, glyphosate, and dicamba. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I did at the Hoops property across from the Safeway. And the map up on the left represents the red represents basically what my infestation was. Basically, when I came to work in 2007. And basically, what I'm going to cover here is basically we use goats. And in 2009, we used about 500 head. And they were active from July to early August, and they were feeding on the infestation. In 2010, we had 900 head in mid-June and late June, and then we followed that up with herbicidal applications that were made after the goats in September and October. And basically, I unfortunately this is not a chemical that's available to homeowners. It's called Milestone. It's aminopyrrolate is the active ingredient, and we did it at 6 to 7 ounces per acre. Extremely low use when you think about it. Basically, just so you have an idea of my mix rate there, that 6 ounces was going into 25 gallons of water. So it's the use rates are very, very low. It's very, very effective. The reason it's not available to homeowners, unfortunately, is because it does persist in the environment. It doesn't move off site, but the problem is that it does persist in the environment, and it persists basically in the vegetation. This was the result after 2 years of treating with the goats, and then in combination with the herbicidal treatments. I went from basically, almost a solid stand of Canada Thistle to what you see on the right there. The pictures are taken in almost the identical locations. And this, like I said, was about 2 to 3 years after treatments were done. So we had phenomenal results, just really good results. It's a great example of integrated pest management and how it can and does work. So Russian olive, Elaeagnus angustifolia. It's not a true olive tree. It's a member of the Aster family, actually. It's a perennial shrub or tree. It's 10 to 40 feet tall with about a 10 to 40 foot spread. Its flowers are yellow, green, and very fragrant. I don't like the smell of them. Some people think it's a wonderful smell. For whatever reason, I don't think it is. I think it's kind of like a paperwhite thing, in that some people it smells horrible to them, and other people it smells great. It has thorny reddish brown stems, as you can see on the right there, and then the fruits. There's a picture of the fruit on the inset, and that's what birds really like to feed on. And what tends to happen, unfortunately, when they eat that seed, is they pull it into their crop. They scrape off the outer hull of that seed, and they scarify and prep that seed for germination, and then they fly someplace else, perch, and then they cough it back out into the environment. And if the situation's right, basically that seed is ripe for germination and ready to go. So its leaves are lance-shaped, 1 to 3 inches long. They're light green. Like I said, the fruits assemble in olive, and birds love them, and they'll transport them many miles away, aiding in the spread. The roots are extensive and sucker heavily. It's a serious issue in riparian areas. If you want to see that in action, basically all you have to do is go to the Dry Creek corridor, both in Westminster and Broomfield, and take a look at that, and you can kind of see what can happen. So control, basically you want a basal prune, and basically that's a fancy term for basically cutting it down. And then you need to apply some sort of herbicidal treatment. In your case, it would be Roundup to freshly cut stumps within 10 minutes of removal. Usually after 10 minutes of removal, what happens is the stump cavitates and prevents that Roundup from actually going down and getting into the root system. So you want to use a high concentration formulation. I use 100%, and you don't need to cover the entire stump. You just need to cover the outer edge of it, so it gets into the phloem and gets taken down into the tree, into the root system of the tree. And get them early; they grow fast. It's pretty amazing how fast these guys do grow. So the picture on the right is actually a picture from Ellie's Pond at the field, which is just north of Midway Boulevard near the Bruner House. And I've basically employed the Mile High Youth Course to remove Russian olives on our open spaces in Broomfield since 2009, I believe. So purple loosestrife. I always mention this one because we actually had a homeowner who had this, and that's how it got into Broomfield County and into a drainage in Broomfield County. Lythrum salicaria. It's a perennial forb. I've kind of covered it a little bit. It's about 6 to 8 feet tall. It's only found in wet sites. You're only going to find it in wetlands and drainages. The flowers are purple with 5 to 7 petals and racemes, and that's just a fancy word for spike, as you can see from the picture on the right. It flowers from June through August, and it has, so if you grab the stem on it, if you're not knowing what it is or you're wondering if it is, it has a distinctive 4-sided stem. On that picture right there was taken from Ellie's Pond. So far, I've only found 5 plants there, but I keep tabs on it to make sure we're getting it. But the reason I mention this is because it has been found on properties, homeowners' properties, because it's actually a really pretty plant. And a lot of these guys are, but they're just an ecological disaster for us. Its leaves are lance-shaped with smooth edges. It is an escaped ornamental, so it was brought over to the United States from Europe, and Europe basically as an ornamental. It diminishes wildlife habitat and replaces native vegetation. And like I said, it can produce a ton of seed, up to 3 million seeds per plant, with up to a 20-year seed viability. So control measures, pulling it, may work on small infestations, but you've got to make sure you get the roots and all. If you don't, it's just not going to work. If it's flowering or forming flower heads, remove the flower heads, bag them, and dispose of them. And then herbicides that you can use. And these generally, because purple loosestrife tends to occur on wet sites, if you're treating in a wet site area, you want to use a herbicide that's labeled for water use. Probably doesn't apply to most homeowners, but if you do encounter it or have a drainage through your property and you do encounter this, you want to make sure whatever you're using is listed as an aquatic herbicide. And those options are glyphosate, tricloclear, and imazapyr. And this is another one of everybody's favorites is puncture vine, Tribulus terrestris. It's an annual forb. It's mat forming. It germinates. What I tend to see is it germinates after the first spring or summer rainstorms that we get. And I don't even bother spraying it anymore. That's how fast it'll start to grow. What I generally do is when we get like one of those big monsoon moistures in like June, well, not monsoon, but if we get like a freak thunderstorm, we get one of our thunderstorms in June, July, or August, I kind of have an idea of what areas we have it in, and we go out and pull it by hand. The nice thing about Annualforbes, they spend a lot of energy on vegetative growth and flowering and seed growth because they only get one chance as an annual. They don't have an extensive root system, so they can be pulled very, very easily. This one's really fun to actually go out and pull because it's actually satisfying because you get the entire root system. And a lot of times, like that mat that you see on the lower right, when I do fold that back and find the root system and pull it out of the ground, usually only tends to be like 6 to 8 inches deep, and maybe not much more than that in as far as width and diameter. So it's a very non-extensive root system. The flowers are small and they're 5-petaled and they're yellow, and it flowers from July to October. Usually the biggest months, I've been starting to see it come up in June. I would say June, July, August, and into September. Usually into October, we're getting a little late, but because usually when we get precipitation, it usually comes in the form of snow by October, but it can germinate in October as well. The fruits are about a 1/2 inch wide with sharp spiny burrs, as you can see on the right. Those are actually haven't dried yet. They change color a little bit and they turn a little bit darker. But they really like to puncture both. They like to puncture tires on bikes, especially. Basically, like some of the areas that I have it, I've basically driven the truck over it, and then basically before I leave those open spaces, I stop, park the truck, and I basically wipe off all of the puncture vine that's basically attached to my tires, so I'm not spreading it to other areas. And it's notorious for hobbling pets as well. The seeds may be viable for up to 5 years in the soil, which isn't very long, but it produces a lot of seed because it is an annual. Control measures, it's an annual, like I said, pull it, bag it, and dispose of it. That's generally the approach that I take to it. Shallow tilling and hoeing of young plants does work. Mulching to a depth of 3 inches will work if all light is screened out from the existing seed. So if you're going to mulch it, make sure you're covering it well. Get 3 inches, 4 inches, and cover it up, and that'll work. Biocontrols, I have administered these here in Broomfield. There is a seed weevil that is available through the insectarian, and it does work very well. Like, again, I always put the caveat on there, unless you have a really big problem, it's probably not always the best way to go. As homeowners, I would say hand pulling is probably the easiest for you. Herbicides that work, 2,4-D, glyphosate, dicamba, and imazapyr. Like I said, in all honesty, I've basically deployed more biocontrols and pulling of it than I have herbicide treatments. So it seems to be more effective to me. This is Myrtle Spurge. And this is one I covered because it tends to be a list A species that tends to occur on homeowner properties. And you can see there, it's a xeric plant. When you do look at it, it can grow in really tough conditions, and it was basically introduced as an ornamental. It's a list A species. Again, it's deeply rooted, so its maximum height is 6 to 12 inches tall, and basically the root system can go as many as 18 to 20 feet. So when you are dealing with it, you have to realize that. So it's deeply rooted. It is a succulent. So again, it has xeric habits, and being a succulent, it can really survive really hot conditions. That's why you'll find it in a lot of basically homes from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. you'll find it because it was used as a xeric plant back then. It was used as a ground cover. It's poisonous to livestock, and it outcompetes both your plant material and native plant material. It tends to be a bigger problem in the foothills than it does down here on the plains. I will admit that. Boulder County has a real problem in the foothills on it, but it can be a big problem down here as well, but it tends to be more so in the mountains. So as far as control measures, pulling, make sure that you use a shovel and get as much of the root as possible, and then repeat, and do that over and over and over again. When we pull it, generally what we do is we bring a shovel out. Wherever we find it, we dig down as deep as we can into the ground and break it off below the ground and then cover it up with soil. And then you got to come back and check it. But just remember, if you're going to do this process, you need to remember to wear gloves. Sap of the plant is toxic. It can cause blindness as well as burn your hands. Currently, there are no biocontrols for Myrtle Spurge. You can't deploy biocontrols for List A species in the state of Colorado because they are designated for eradication. That's the reason why. Herbicides that work, dicamba, good spelling there, dicamba and 2,4-D. And then as far as the biocontrols go, just to add a little something on that, I told you that the insect dairy here out of Palisade, which is over near Grand Junction, basically tends to produce for other states as well. They are producing biocontrols for List A species. They are basically creating biocontrols. There's I believe an insect that they are producing for the eastern United States for purple loosestrife, but they can't deploy it here in the state because it is a List A species. Another one that we see a lot homeowners' properties, and it is a List B species, is Dame's Rocket or Dame's Violet, Hesperus matronalis. And it's a biennial or short-lived perennial. It can be anywhere, depending upon how much moisture it gets, it can be 4 inches tall to 3 feet. It reproduces by seed only. So if you do see it and you find it, the nice thing about this is if you get rid of it before it's gone to seed, you're going to get rid of it. It's the only way that it reproduces. Its flowers are white to purple, but generally they're that lavender purplish color that you see in the picture. The leaves are alternate, 2 to 4 inches long, lance-shaped and finely toothed. And it's a very pretty flower. I live in Louisville, and we have several properties here that have it spreading out all over the place. And I'm sure that the city's aware of it, but it is a really pretty plant. It does have a shallow fibrous root system. Again, biennials and annuals tend to have a more shallow root system. It's not always the case, but it tends to be. You can find it in gardens, woodlands, ditches. It basically can occur just about anywhere. I will say it's probably more of a water-loving species, so you're probably going to find it in areas where the precipitation's a little bit higher, or it's shaded and cool, and you tend to have more water present. As far as control measure, hand pulling does work very well. Make sure you get all the root system, and if you don't, just prevent it from resprouting. Pull it again, dig it out, do whatever you can. If flowering or seed is set, make sure you bag it, and basically close that bag and make sure you get rid of it. Also, cut flowering heads off to prevent seed set. And herbicides that are used are glyphosate and triclopyr. There's probably a few more, but those are the two that are available to homeowners. So I always cover greener alternatives because a lot of people want to know about them. So vinegar is an option. Just know that vinegar is not systemic. When you do spray it on the plant, it's not getting transported throughout the vascular system of the plant and spread throughout into the root system. It's a burn down product only. When you buy it straight off the shelf, it's a 10% solution, and that is what you are using out of the spray bottle. You need to use it at full strength. And I always caution people, vinegar is caustic as well. Basically, if you're going to be using vinegar as an option, you need to make sure that you are wearing gloves, wearing chemical gloves. Regular leather gloves probably aren't advisable. You need to wear chemical gloves when applying vinegar, and be careful, again, don't get it in your eyes. So you need to be careful with it, even though vinegar is a greener alternative, and it is organic. It can cause harm to you when you're using it. Another one I always point out is boiling water, and I use this at my own house. Basically for weeds and cracks in sidewalks or driveways, you can boil a pot of water on your stove or range, and then basically bring it out front and pour it on there. Just remember when you're doing it, obviously if you're doing it close to the lawn or close to that, as long as you're keeping that boiling water kind of separated from the lawn, because if it gets into the lawn, it'll affect the lawn as well. But I've had really good results with boiling water for crack weeds. And then biocontrols, I always point out, it's not a magic bullet. It's going to reduce the overall population and help control flowering and do things like that, but it will not eliminate the plant. It's not going to do that. It's not going to eat itself out of house and home. It's just going to help aid in the process. And then mulching is a really good way to control weeds. It tends to suppress them. Make sure your depth is 3 to 4 inches. So basically herbicides, everything that I've mentioned in this presentation is available off the shelf to homeowners. Just a list that I went through is 2,4-D, dicamba, glyphosate, triclopyr, quinclorac, and imazapyr. I did mention aminopyrrolid, which was Milestone. It is not available to homeowners. They were working on trying to make it available to homeowners, but I don't think, because of the longevity in the environment, I think they're a little concerned about it with grass clippings and other things, and can get into your compost. So that basically concludes my my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have at this point in time. All right. Thank you. If you have any other questions, my email address is there. If I have any small acreage owners here in the city, county of Broomfield, you can feel free to reach out to me. Or if you're wondering about a specific weed, you can actually contact me at the email that was provided. And I'll just put it out there. It's my name is up there. It's Nathan Kelby. You can also find me on the directory for county weed coordinators through the state. But my email address is nkelby, K-E-L-B as in bread, E as in Edward, @broomfield.org. And you are welcome to go ahead and contact me that way. Thanks.